Imagine a battlefield gamble so extreme that it sounds like a paradox, using a nuclear strike not to start an apocalyptic war, but to stop one. This is the essence of what many believe to be Russia's escalate to de-escalate doctrine. The idea is chilling yet oddly calculated, and it has sparked intense debate among experts and policymakers. Is Moscow really prepared to raise the stakes to unimaginable heights in order to calm a conflict on its terms? How might such a strategy play out in reality, and what would the rest of the world do in response? In this article, we'll demystify Russia's supposed escalate to de-escalate policy in plain language. We'll explore where this concept came from, whether it's an official game plan or a misunderstood myth, and what risks it carries. We'll also consider how an adversary, like NATO or the United States, might respond differently than Russia hopes. The topic may sound technical, but its implications could not be more grave, so let's break it down for a general understanding. This is the DEFCON warning system. If you find these articles helpful and informative, click the like and subscribe button. That helps others find these articles. Also leave a comment. We would love to hear your thoughts on this subject. At its core, escalate to de-escalate refers to the notion of using a limited nuclear strike to force an enemy to back down. In theory, if Russia were losing a conventional war, it might escalate dramatically by detonating a small nuclear weapon in order to de-escalate the conflict on terms favorable to Moscow. The shock of a nuclear blast, even a low-yield, tactical one, is assumed to cow the adversary into halting hostilities. Russian military writings have explicitly discussed this concept, for example, using a single nuclear strike or even a demonstration blast as a stern warning shot to convince the enemy that Russia is willing to cross the nuclear threshold. The targeted strike would likely be on a critical military asset, say a NATO airbase, a carrier group at sea, or a massed troop formation, rather than a major city, in order to signal limited aims and avoid immediate all-out nuclear war. By inflicting a taste of nuclear horror but not total devastation, the Kremlin's logic is that the enemy's will to fight would collapse. To be clear, this idea is not about winning a nuclear war outright. It's about coercion, using one or a few nuclear blows as the ultimate attention-getter to compel peace on Russia's terms. The phrase escalate to de-escalate itself is often used by Western analysts to summarize this approach. As one analysis on the DEFCON warning system site plainly puts it, it means escalating a conventional war by using a nuclear weapon in order to de-escalate, i.e. shock the adversary into backing down. In other words, break the enemy's will to continue by proving that Moscow is ready to do the unthinkable. Where did this unnerving strategy come from? Its roots trace back to Russia's post-Cold War military thinking. In the late 1990s, Russia's conventional forces were a shadow of the mighty Soviet Red Army, while NATO remained strong. Russian strategists grew concerned that in a major war, Russia might not be able to win with tanks, troops, and aircraft alone. Nuclear weapons, once seen only as a last resort deterrent, started to be viewed as a possible equalizer on the battlefield. A key moment came in 1999 during a military exercise called Zapad 99, West 99. In this war game, Russian forces, faced with a hypothetical NATO onslaught, simulated nuclear strikes to stave off defeat. The message was blunt: if things get dire, Russia might fire a warning nuke to stop a losing war. This was further cemented in Russia's official 2000 military doctrine, which explicitly dropped the old Soviet pledge of no first use of nuclear weapons. Instead, the 2000 doctrine stated that if a war could not be won conventionally, Russia reserved the option to use nuclear weapons to end the conflict on favorable terms. In other words, nuclear first use was on the table if Russia's national survival was at stake or even to avoid a major defeat. This laid the groundwork for what later became labeled as escalate to de-escalate. Throughout the 2000s, as Russia regained some strength, its official line on nuclear use evolved. The 2010 and 2014 updates to Russia's doctrine appeared to raise the threshold for nuclear strikes, saying nukes would be considered only when the very existence of the state is threatened. That phrasing suggested a somewhat more defensive stance, implying Moscow wouldn't jump to nukes unless truly at risk of annihilation. Many observers took this to mean the bar for escalate to de-escalate had been set higher. Russia might not toss a nuke into a battle unless Russia itself was on the brink of collapse. However, the picture is complicated. In 2020, Russia released a document on nuclear policy that, while mostly reaffirming nuclear weapons as a last resort, kept things strategically ambiguous. Notably, it didn't mention Russia's large arsenal of tactical, non-strategic, nuclear warheads, which are exactly the kind one might use in an escalate to de-escalate scenario. Then, amid the war in Ukraine, signs emerged that Russia's stance might be shifting again. In late 2024, President Putin approved amendments to Doctrine seemingly lowering the nuclear threshold once more. The new language says Russia reserves the right to use nuclear weapons not only if the state's existence is in peril, but also in response to a major conventional attack that threatens Russia's sovereignty or territorial integrity. In plain terms, if a conventional, non-nuclear, war is going very badly, say, a NATO intervention overwhelming Russian forces, Moscow now claims it could answer with a nuclear strike even before Russia is actually collapsing. This essentially revives the escalate to de-escalate idea, using a nuclear blow to stop a conventional defeat in its tracks. It's worth noting that during the Cold War, NATO itself had a playbook not so different in concept. Outgunned by the massive Soviet conventional army in Europe, NATO strategists planned for possible limited nuclear strikes to halt a Warsaw Pact invasion. The logic back then was also to shock the enemy into pausing, eerily similar to what we now attribute to Russia. Thankfully, those scenarios never left the drawing board. But it shows that escalate to de-escalate is not an entirely new or uniquely Russian notion. It's a role that tactical nuclear weapons have long been imagined to play when one side is outmatched in a conventional fight. Despite the frequent references to it, there's an ongoing debate. Does Russia truly plan to do this, or is it a Western misinterpretation? The term escalate to de-escalate actually originated in Western analyses of Russian strategy. Russian officials themselves don't use that catchy rhyme in public. What they do say and do, however, provides fodder for both sides of the argument. On one hand, many US and NATO officials, defense analysts, and think tank experts assert that this is indeed Russia's game plan. They point to the post-Cold War doctrinal changes, Russia's investment in a vast array of tactical nukes, and Putin's own nuclear saber-rattling. The United States' 2018 Nuclear Posture Review explicitly cited Russia's purported escalate to de-escalate strategy as a real threat. American officials worry Moscow believes the West would lack the resolve to hit back if Russia popped off one or two small nuclear weapons. This concern even spurred the US to develop a new low-yield nuclear warhead for its submarines, to show Moscow that the US could respond in kind and thus deter Russia from ever trying in the first place. In essence, Western hawks argue that Moscow sees nuclear coercion as a viable tactic, and the West must prepare to counter it. On the other hand, some experts, including a number of respected Western Russia watchers, argue that escalate to de-escalate is oversimplified or even a myth. They note that Russian officials vehemently deny any such aggressive, low-threshold nuclear doctrine. According to Moscow, nuclear weapons are for deterrence and defense only, to be used only in dire circumstances, like an existential threat to the state, not as a tool of casual battlefield strategy. Analysts in this camp point out that since at least 2010, Russia's formal doctrine raised the nuclear use threshold, not lowered it. They caution that Western focus on a hypothetical limited Russian nuke strike might be overblown, neglecting the fact that any nuclear use would be an absolute last resort from Russia's own perspective. As one analysis put it, describing Russian strategy as escalate to de-escalate can be an unproductive simplification. It fixates on one scenario and risks underestimating Russia's true deterrence priorities. In short, This view holds that Russia's nuclear strategy is primarily about deterring the West from attacking them, not about springing nuclear ambushes at the drop of a hat. Each perspective has some evidence behind it. It's true that Russian exercises and past statements have signaled a willingness to go nuclear if push comes to shove. Remember Zapad, 99, or Putin musing that he'd use all means at our disposal if Russia's existence is threatened. It's also true that recent Kremlin rhetoric amid the Ukraine war has been extremely nuclear-flavored, perhaps to scare NATO off. But it's also true that crossing the nuclear threshold carries immense risk for Russia too, and Russian leaders know it. Even as he rattles sabers, Putin often reiterates that nuclear war must never be fought and claims Russia would only use nukes in extreme desperation. In practice, Russia benefits by keeping the world guessing, hinting it might resort to a nuke so as to deter its enemies by fear, while hopefully never actually doing so. Bottom line, escalate to de-escalate is half doctrine, half interpretation. There is no official document in Moscow that uses those exact words, but Russia's policies and capabilities have been deliberately structured to give them an option of early nuclear use if they're losing badly. Whether they would ever really pull that trigger is another question, one we dearly hope never gets answered. How might it play out in reality? Let's imagine the worst-case scenario. A war between Russia and NATO, or another major power, is going badly for Moscow. Russia's military is on the verge of a large-scale defeat. Conventional options are exhausted. This is the kind of moment the escalate to de-escalate play is designed for. How would it actually unfold? Russia might first issue explicit warnings, for example, moving nuclear-capable forces into the open or making menacing statements, to telegraph that it is prepared to use nuclear weapons if pushed further. Throughout the Ukraine conflict, Putin and his top officials have repeatedly reminded the world of Russia's nuclear might as a form of warning signal. If the enemy offensive continued, Russia could then choose a dramatic demonstration. One oft-discussed possibility is a single low-yield nuclear detonation in a way that minimizes immediate casualties but maximizes shock value. For instance, Russia could explode a warhead high above the battlefield or over an isolated area as a warning shot, causing an electromagnetic pulse and bright flash, but relatively little blast damage on the ground. This would be a last-ditch message: we are willing to go nuclear. Back off now. Potentially, if Russia resorts to a nuclear strike, it could hit a high-value military target to make the point unmistakable. Such targets often speculated include a NATO airbase, a carrier strike group in the ocean, a major logistics hub, or a large troop concentration. The yield of the nuclear warhead might be deliberately kept small, perhaps in the range of a few kilotons, a fraction of the Hiroshima bomb size, though still devastating, to show that this is a limited strike, not all-out Armageddon. By choosing a target away from major cities and using just one, or a very limited number, of warheads, Russian planners would aim to demonstrate resolve while containing the damage. The strike might annihilate, say, an airfield or a naval flotilla, killing perhaps thousands of military personnel. Horrifying, yet far less than a full-scale nuclear assault on a city would cause. Russia would then likely declare, perhaps through a direct hotline message to Western leaders and publicly via media, that this nuclear strike was a one-time measure to defend its vital interests and that it will launch more if the enemy doesn't stand down. This is the de-escalation offer, as coercive as it gets. The intended effect is to freeze the conflict, confront the enemy with the immediate terror of nuclear war in hopes that Washington, Brussels, or whichever adversary loses their will to continue. Moscow would probably call for urgent negotiations at this point, demanding terms that secure its objectives, for example, telling NATO to withdraw or Ukraine to surrender disputed territory. In summary, the scenario would be a thunderclap nuclear strike, then a pause with an ultimatum. It's a monumental gamble, relying on the adversary to be so horrified that they accept a peace favorable to Russia rather than risk further nuclear exchange. It's the equivalent of firing a warning shot from a gun pressed to the world's temple. If all this sounds incredibly risky, that's because it is. The escalate to de-escalate strategy carries severe dangers, not just for Russia's foes, but for Russia itself and the entire world. Here are some of the key risks if Moscow ever tried this nuclear gambit. Uncontrolled escalation. There is no guarantee a conflict would actually de-escalate after a nuclear blast. In fact, it could escalate uncontrollably. The enemy, shocked as they may be, might decide to retaliate rather than capitulate. For example, the United States and NATO might respond to a Russian nuclear strike with overwhelming conventional force, devastating Russia's troops and military assets. Retired U.S. General David Petraeus has warned that in such an event, America would lead a NATO campaign to take out every Russian conventional force in Ukraine and even sink Russia's fleet. The danger then is that Russia, feeling cornered, might strike again, possibly with larger nukes, and once that deadly back and forth begins, it's hard to see where it would stop. One U.S. report noted that any limited nuclear use runs the risk of escalating to a much broader and more destructive nuclear conflict. In essence, once the nuclear threshold is crossed, all bets are off. A plan meant to end a war could instead ignite a full-scale nuclear war. Misjudgment and miscalculation. The escalate to de-escalate theory assumes the enemy will react in a specific way, i.e., they'll lose their nerve. But what if that assumption is wrong? Predicting human and national behavior under unprecedented duress is fraught with uncertainty. The enemy leadership might be so enraged by the nuclear attack that they refuse to back down, calculating that conceding now would invite further aggression later. They might also misinterpret the scope of the nuclear strike, for instance, assuming it's the first of many to come, and overreact with even greater force. If NATO commanders don't recognize a Russian strike as a one-off, limited use, they could respond as if full nuclear war is starting. The fog of war and communication breakdowns could make control very shaky once the nukes start flying. In short, Russia cannot be sure that one nuclear blast will be enough to compel the enemy. It might just stiffen the enemy's resolve or cause panic that leads to retaliation. Global backlash and isolation. Using a nuclear weapon, even a small one, would make Russia an international pariah and could shatter any remaining support or neutrality it has abroad. Countries that have been friendly or on the fence, China, India, etc., would come under massive global pressure to condemn Moscow. It's likely even Beijing and Delhi, who have been tolerant of Russia's actions to some extent, would be alarmed and angered by the breaking of the 80-year nuclear taboo. As one former U.S. ambassador put it, a limited nuclear strike would be fraught with political and military peril for Russia, likely alienating even friendly powers. The loss of diplomatic support could cripple Russia's economy and strategic position in the long run. Furthermore, a nuclear strike in, say, Europe could spread radioactive fallout into neighboring countries, harming civilians and even impacting NATO territory. Wind doesn't respect borders. If NATO citizens are hurt by radiation, it could invoke collective defense responses even if the blast itself was not on NATO soil, pulling even more countries directly into the fray. The humanitarian and environmental consequences would be horrific and long-lasting, devastating Russia's reputation worldwide. Crossing the point of no return, perhaps the biggest risk for Russia, if it plays the nuclear card, it can never take it back. The deterrence power of nuclear threats lies partly in the fact they are unused. Once a country actually uses a nuclear weapon in war, it has crossed a line that hugely raises the stakes for all sides. For Russia, firing even one nuclear shot would likely mean losing any chance at a negotiated off-ramp that doesn't end in humiliation. It would also ensure that any Western hesitation to get involved militarily would evaporate. NATO, under strong domestic pressures, might feel compelled to intervene directly at that point, if they weren't already involved, to stop a regime willing to go nuclear. Essentially, Russia would be burning its bridges. This is why even Russian leadership, for all its bluster, seems to fear actually going through with it. Putin and his generals know that once that genie is out of the bottle, Russia's own survival would hang by a thread. The crux of escalate to de-escalate is the expectation that the enemy will blink first. Moscow would be hoping, in fact, banking on, A scenario like this, NATO's leaders, horrified by a nuclear detonation and the specter of further escalation, immediately convene and decide enough. It's not worth risking New York, London, or Paris over this conflict. Let's negotiate an end on Russian terms. In Russia's ideal scenario, the West basically capitulates out of fear, perhaps pressuring Ukraine, or whichever battlefield is at issue, to accept a peace deal that favors Moscow's objectives. In Putin's calculation, Western countries are fundamentally risk-averse, not willing to trade Moscow for, say, Kiev. By showing he's not risk-averse, willing to use a nuke, he hopes the other side will back down. However, what Russia hopes to achieve and what would likely happen could be very different. History and strategy suggest that a foe like the United States or NATO might not simply roll over after a nuclear sucker punch. In fact, they could respond in ways Russia does not want at all. As discussed, one likely response would be a devastating conventional military retaliation by NATO, designed to punish Russia without immediately resorting to nuclear weapons. The goal for NATO in that case would be to cripple Russia's ability to conduct war by, for example, annihilating its forces in the conflict zone as Petraeus described, yet stop short of triggering all-out nuclear exchange. NATO would also urgently shore up its own nuclear forces and alert levels to deter Russia from firing a second nuclear strike. The irony is that Russia's attempt at de-escalation through terror could unify its adversaries even more and stiffen Western resolve to see the war through to a victorious conclusion, precisely the opposite of capitulation. As one nuclear strategist noted, there's no reason to assume the enemy will give in. Instead, a limited nuclear attack will aggravate the crisis, making the enemy even more determined to respond. Nobody wants to set a precedent of being blackmailed by nukes. Diplomatically, our Russian nuclear use would likely erase any divisions within the NATO alliance about supporting the war. If before some members were hesitating on how much to help, after a nuclear incident you can bet all NATO members would be on the same page that Russia must be contained. It's also possible that countries which had been staying out of the conflict might decide to join a coalition against Russia after such a world-altering provocation. Even outside of the immediate military realm, the West and others would have powerful responses, crippling economic sanctions far beyond any seen before, and international isolation of Russia would kick in at a new level. Russia would essentially become a global outlaw. The pressure on any country still dealing with Russia to cut ties would be immense. In short, Russia thinks an enemy faced with nuclear escalation will lose its will, but more likely, the enemy's will to resist would harden. The West would be forced to respond forcefully, one way or another. It might not reply with nuclear weapons immediately, since NATO would also want to avoid full nuclear war if possible, but it would almost certainly retaliate in some fashion that risks further escalation. This is why escalate to de-escalate is often described by experts as a very dangerous gamble. If the adversary calls the bluff or even just stumbles into escalating back, the situation could spiral into full-scale nuclear catastrophe, which helps no one, not even Moscow. As a recent analysis in the DEFCON warning system observed, even Russia's leadership likely realizes that using a nuke in anything less than an existential scenario would be fraught with peril and could leave Russia worse off, potentially friendless and in ruins. Russia's escalate to de-escalate policy sits at the murky intersection of brinkmanship and horror. On paper, it offers Moscow a way to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat by wielding its most feared weapon in a controlled burst. In practice, however, it's a strategy riddled with uncertainties. Is it real? Yes, in the sense that Russia has given itself the tools and doctrinal wiggle room to use nuclear weapons in a limited fashion if cornered. But it's not a foolproof blueprint. It's more of a high-stakes theory of victory that might crumble on contact with reality. The real-world execution of such a doctrine would be profoundly risky. The first use of a nuclear weapon in warfare since 1945 would break a monumental taboo and open Pandora's box. No one can confidently predict what would happen next, but the risks of escalation are immense. Moscow hopes that by threatening to go nuclear, or even actually doing so once, it can control the course of a conflict. But as we've examined, an adversary like NATO is unlikely to simply surrender. More likely, they would respond with strength of their own, potentially turning a limited nuclear clash into something even more dangerous. The very act meant to de-escalate could trigger a chain reaction of escalation. Thus, what Russia thinks would be a neat trick to end a war on its terms could instead make a bad situation far worse for everyone, Russia included. For the general public, it's important to understand this doctrine not as a surefire Russian game plan, but as a sign of how precarious great power conflicts can become. It underscores why resolving disputes before they reach a shooting war is so critical. Because if a war reaches the point where one side considers lobbing a nuclear weapon to de-escalate things, the world is already balanced on the knife's edge of disaster. In the end, whether escalate to de-escalate remains an abstract theory or becomes a tragic reality will depend on decisions made in the heat of crisis. Let us hope those decisions never have to be made, and that this provocative doctrine stays in the realm of theory. The paradox of using nuclear destruction to preserve peace may itself need to be de-escalated by sober minds, long before any mushroom clouds appear on the horizon. This is the DEFCON warning system.